The sound was distinct, the sharp metallic click of the locker room door latching shut, followed immediately by a shift in the air pressure. I didn't flinch. I stood there, half-dressed, the cool air hitting my skin, grounded in my own space. In the mirror's reflection, I saw her. Addison. She wasn't moving. She was watching. Her gaze was fixed on the curve of my back, heavy and unashamed. I met her eyes in the glass. "Eyes up," I said, my voice low. She didn't retreat. She stepped forward, breathless, the professional mask slipping. "Can I stay with you?" she asked. The question hung there, suspended in the steam, changing the night's trajectory instantly. The high-end fitness studio after hours is a different creature than it is during the day. During the sunlight hours, it is a chaotic ecosystem of bass-heavy music, shouting, and the clatter of weights. But at 10 at night, it becomes a temple of sterile precision. The air is thick with the scent of eucalyptus from the steam room and the underlying sharp tang of disinfectant. The ventilation system hums a low, constant note, a sound that usually signals the end of my day, the moment I get to reclaim my body from the clients who rent it by the hour. I am the senior trainer here. My reputation is built on a foundation of absolute control and biomechanical perfection. Addison is the only other person in this building who understands that language. She is my rival, my mirror image in intensity, though her style is more explosive where mine is measured. We usually move around each other like two apex predators sharing a territory. Respectful, but always keeping a calculated distance. Tonight, that distance had collapsed. I had been in the process of peeling off my sports bra, the damp fabric clinging stubbornly to my skin, when she walked in. The door had opened and closed, and I knew it was her before I even looked. The cadence of her breathing was audible, slightly ragged, which was uncharacteristic for a woman who could run a marathon without looking winded. I could have covered up. A towel was within arm's reach on the bench. Modesty would have been the professional choice, the safe choice. But I didn't reach for it. I let the bra drop to the floor and stood there, bare from the waist up, facing the mirror. I watched her, watching me. The room felt suddenly smaller, the damp heat pressing in against us. The silence was charged, heavy with the things we never said on the gym floor. In the reflection, I saw her eyes trace the line of my spine, the definition of my shoulders. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a hungry, desperate thing. When I gave the command, "Eyes up," it wasn't a rebuke. It was a challenge. I wanted her to acknowledge the tension, to stop hiding behind the rivalry. She stepped further into the room, the fluorescent lights harsh on her face. She looked wrecked. That was the only word for it. Her usual armor, the sleek ponytail, the branded gear, the impenetrable confidence, was fractured. She was holding a duffel bag like a shield across her chest. "I can't go home," she said, her voice lacking its usual edge. It sounded thin, stripped of authority. "My building, a pipe burst on the floor above. The ceiling in my bedroom is on the floor. The landlord said it's not safe to be in there until they check the structural integrity." She paused, swallowing hard. "I called 3 hotels. Everything near here is booked for that convention downtown. I didn't know where else to go." I turned around then, facing her fully. The vulnerability in her posture was jarring. Addison didn't ask for help. She demanded excellence. Seeing her like this, unmoored and asking for sanctuary, shifted the ground beneath us. The rivalry was a clean, safe dynamic. Bringing her home, into my private sanctuary, was messy. It was dangerous. It blurred a line I had drawn in permanent marker years ago. But looking at her, seeing the exhaustion etched around her eyes, and the way her hands gripped the strap of her bag until her knuckles turned white, the calculation changed. The instinct to protect her overrode the instinct to protect my solitude. "Wait in the car," I said, the decision made. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since she walked in. She nodded, once, a sharp jerk of her chin, and turned to leave. I reached for my shirt, pulling it on. The sound of her locker slamming shut a moment later echoed through the room, sealing the agreement. The professional boundary hadn't just been crossed. We had just set fire to it. We have maintained a cold war of perfectionism on the gym floor for 6 months. It is a silent, brutal conflict fought with perfect form and heavy plates. To the clients, we are just two high-level trainers coexisting in the same premium space. But to anyone paying attention, and we are always paying attention to each other, it is a constant, high-stakes negotiation of dominance. I know her biomechanics better than I know my own pulse. I have spent hours watching her from the periphery of my vision, analyzing the explosive power she favors. She is all fast-twitch muscle fibers and dynamic movement, a storm of controlled chaos. I am the counterpoint, time under tension, slow eccentrics, absolute stability. We don't speak often. We don't need to. We communicate through the aggressive correction of a client's squat depth or the way we load a barbell with a precision that dares the other to find a flaw. For months, we have been circling each other. I have felt her eyes on me when I demonstrate a deadlift, a heavy, tangible weight on my skin that has nothing to do with the iron in my hands. I have caught her tracking my movement across the studio floor, her gaze dark and calculating, only to snap away the second I turned my head. It is a hyper-awareness that borders on obsession. When she is in the room, the air pressure changes. The hum of the ventilation system seems to drop an octave, vibrating in my chest. This tension has never been just professional. We told ourselves it was. We wrapped it in the safe, sterile language of athletics and competition. We pretended that the heat rising under our collars was just adrenaline, just the drive to be the best. But that was a lie. It was a suppressed, heavy attraction, masked as rivalry. It was the kind of pull that exists between two people who are fluent in the same physical language, but have never been allowed to speak it. That is why the moment in the locker room played out the way it did. When I said, "Eyes up," it wasn't a rejection of her gaze. It was an acknowledgement. I was telling her that I knew. I was telling her that I had been watching her watch me for months. And tonight, I was done pretending I didn't enjoy it. By not covering up, by standing there in the raw vulnerability of my own skin, I was escalating the game. I was giving her what she had been stealing in glances, the full, unflinching reality of me. And by stepping forward instead of retreating, she had accepted the terms. But the dynamic had shifted. On the floor, we are equals. Or perhaps she even holds the edge in raw aggression. Tonight, however, the architecture of our rivalry had crumbled. She was the one with the burst pipe and the ruined ceiling. She was the one standing in damp clothes, stripped of her sanctuary, needing mine. The woman who usually commanded the room with a terrifying charisma was now waiting for my cue. She had handed me the power, not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. I finished tying my shoes, the mundane action feeling strangely significant. The silence in the locker room was no longer a standoff. It was a prelude. I grabbed my keys, the metal biting into my palm. When I opened the door to the main studio, the lights were already dimmed, casting long, skeletal shadows across the equipment. Addison was waiting by the exit, her posture rigid, her bag over her shoulder. She didn't look like a rival anymore. She looked like a complication I had voluntarily invited into my life. We walked out into the night air, the automatic doors sliding open to reveal a world that was wet and slick with rain. The transition from the climate-controlled precision of the gym to the chaotic, damp reality of the street felt jarring. I unlocked my car, the lights flashing a yellow welcome in the dark lot. Addison hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching for the passenger handle. The neutral ground was gone. We were moving into the intimacy of a confined space, and the silence between us was about to get much louder. The moment the car door thudded shut, the world contracted. The storm outside was reduced to a rhythmic, muffled drumming against the metal roof, a relentless percussion that sealed us inside. My car is a compact, a practical vehicle designed for city commuting, not for containing the volatile energy of two women who have spent half a year avoiding a direct collision. Suddenly, the space felt microscopic. The air vents hummed to life, blowing warm, dry air against the windshield to fight the creeping fog of condensation. But it did little to dissipate the thickness in the cabin. Addison sat in the passenger seat, her knees angled slightly toward the center console, invading the neutral zone between us. The scent of her filled the car instantly, a complex, heady mix of rain-dampened fabric, the lingering sharpness of adrenaline, and the underlying salty warmth of exhaustion. It was a smell I associated with the studio, with the high-stakes environment where we usually coexisted. But here, in the dark intimacy of the car, it felt stripped of its professional context. It was just the smell of her skin, distinct and unavoidable. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the leather cool and slick under my palms. I didn't start the engine immediately. For a few seconds, we just sat there, the rain sluicing down the glass in jagged rivers, blurring the neon sign of the gym into a smear of aggressive red light. The silence that settled over us wasn't the comfortable quiet of old friends or the companionable silence of a long drive. It was thick, electric, and heavy with the memory of what had just happened in the locker room. It was the silence of a boundary that had been erased, but not yet redrawn. "The wipers are going to need a minute," I said, the words sounding loud and clumsy in the small space. I reached for the ignition, the engine purring to life, a vibration that traveled up through the seat. "It's fine," Addison replied. Her voice was low, directed at the window rather than at me. She was watching the water distort the world outside, her profile illuminated intermittently by the sweep of headlights from passing cars. I pulled out of the lot, merging into the slick, dark traffic. The city was awash of grays and blacks, punctuated by the angry red of brake lights. I tried to focus on the mechanics of driving, the friction of tires on wet asphalt, the timing of the lights, but my awareness was entirely peripheral. I was hyper-aware of every breath she took. I could hear the slight hitch in her inhalation, a remnant of the stress she was trying to suppress. I was aware of the way her hand rested on her thigh, fingers tapping a restless, silent rhythm against the denim of her jeans. "Did you see the notes on the morning lineup?" I asked, a desperate, reflexive attempt to drag us back to the safety of shop talk. "They shifted the 7 a.m. block." Addison didn't turn. "I saw them." "I was thinking about adjusting the programming for the endurance group," I continued, hating the way my voice sounded. Too brisk, too professional, a shield made of paper. "If we increase the volume on the lower body split, we might risk burnout before Thursday." She turned then, or at least turned her head enough that I could feel the weight of her gaze on the side of my face. "You're talking about squat volume right now?" "I'm talking about the job," I said, tightening my grip on the wheel. "We aren't at the job," she said softly. "And I don't care about the squat volume." The conversation died there, suffocated by the truth of her statement. She was right. The pretense was exhausting. We weren't colleagues discussing strategy. We were two people trapped in a moving box, hurtling toward a destination that felt inevitable and terrifyingly undefined. I drove in silence after that. The rhythm of the windshield wipers became a metronome counting down the blocks. Swish, click. Swish, click. I realized, with a sudden jarring clarity, how little I actually knew about the woman sitting inches away from me. I knew the mechanics of her body better than almost anyone. I knew her squat max to the decimal point. I knew the specific way her left shoulder rolled forward when she was fatigued. I knew the exact shade of flush that rose on her neck when she hit a PR. I knew her biomechanics, her power output, her physical limits, but I didn't know why she had no one else to call tonight. I didn't know if she preferred coffee or tea in the morning. I didn't know what her apartment looked like before the ceiling came down, or what books were on her nightstand. I sat next to a stranger whose body map I had memorized, a paradox that made the air in the car feel thin and insufficient. She shifted in her seat, stretching her legs as much as the footwell allowed. The movement brought her shoulder within a hair's breadth of mine. The heat radiating from her was palpable, a physical force that seemed to bridge the gap without contact. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, watching the rain fracture the light, but my entire body was tuned to that proximity. We turned onto my street. The familiar architecture of my neighborhood usually brought a sense of relief, a signal that the performance of the day was over. Tonight, it felt like the raising of the curtain on a second, far more complicated act. I pulled up to the curb in front of my building, the tires hissing on the wet pavement. I killed the engine. The sudden absence of vibration made the sound of the rain louder, more insistent. "We're here," I said. Addison looked up at the building, then back at me. Her eyes were dark in the shadows of the car, unreadable, but intense. "Okay," she said. It was the final barrier. Once we left the car, Once we crossed the threshold of the lobby and took the elevator up, there would be no more neutral ground. There would be no more distractions. Just the apartment, the rain, and the terrifying reality of having her in my space. My key turned in the lock with a heavy, expensive thud. I pushed the door open and stepped aside to let her in, a gesture that felt less like hospitality and more like surrendering a border. My apartment is not just a place where I sleep. It is a curated extension of my mind. The walls are a stark gallery white. The furniture is low, Italian, and severe. There are no throw pillows, no knickknacks. Everything has a coordinate. It is a space designed for one person. It is a manifesto of control. And then there was Addison. She stepped across the threshold, and the visual dissonance was immediate. Here, she was a chaotic element introduced into a sterile environment. Her sneakers squeaked faintly on the polished concrete floors, a sound that grated against the carefully engineered quiet. She stood in the entryway, dripping water onto the mat, seeming afraid to touch anything, as if her very presence might leave a smudge on the pristine reality I had built. "You can put your bag anywhere," I said, though anywhere was a lie. There was no place for a battered gym bag in this room. She set it down carefully on the floor, tucking it near the wall. It was a jarring spot of color against the monochromatic paint. "Nice place," she murmured. Her voice was too loud in here. "It's clean. I like order," I replied, walking past her into the kitchen. The open plan layout meant there was no escaping each other. I could feel her eyes on my back as I opened the cabinet. I took down 2 glasses, heavy crystal tumblers, and filled them from the filtered tap. My movements were precise, practiced. I was clinging to the ritual of hosting because it was the only script I had left. I turned back to hand her the water. She hadn't moved from the entryway. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, shivering slightly. The cold had settled deep in her bones, bypassing the muscle she worked so hard to build. "Come in," I said, softer this time. "Don't stand by the door." She moved then, walking slowly toward the living room, but she didn't sit. She gravitated toward the floor-to-ceiling window. The rain was lashing against the glass, blurring the lights of the skyline into abstract streaks of gold and red. She stood with her back to me, staring out at the storm she had just escaped, looking like she was waiting for the glass to shatter. I watched her. Stripped of the gym's harsh fluorescent lighting, she looked different. She looked smaller than she did on the lifting platform. The formidable rival who could deadlift twice her body weight was gone. In her place was a woman who was tired, cold, and displaced. A strange territorial instinct flared in my chest. This was my sanctuary. I had built these walls to keep the world out, to keep the messiness of human connection at bay. Seeing her here felt like a violation. But beneath the territorialism was something else, a dangerous, magnetic pull. I didn't just want her out of my space. I wanted to see how she disrupted it. I wanted to see her imprint on the cushions, her presence filling the void I had carefully cultivated. She took a sip of the water, her hand trembling slightly. "I didn't think it would be this quiet," she said. "It's like the city doesn't exist up here." "That's the point," I said. She turned to face me, and the look in her eyes was unguarded. She wasn't analyzing my posture or looking for a weakness. She was just looking at me. The water from her clothes had begun to seep into her shirt, turning the gray fabric dark and clinging to her skin. She was shivering in earnest now, a physical reaction she couldn't suppress. "You're freezing," I stated, the observation cutting through the tension. It wasn't a question of professional courtesy anymore. It was a physiological fact. "I'm fine," she lied. "You're not," I countered, setting my glass down on the island with a sharp click. "And you can't stay in those clothes." I pointed her toward the bathroom, a space of stark white tile and chrome fixtures, and watched the heavy door click shut behind her. The lock turned, a soft, mechanical barrier sliding into place. A moment later, the sound of the shower running cut through the silence of the apartment. It was a mundane noise, the rushing of water through pipes, but in the stillness of my curated sanctuary, it sounded invasive. It sounded intimate. I stood in the center of my living room for a beat, listening. I could visualize the scene with a clarity that felt dangerous. I knew exactly which handle she had turned, the left one, for heat. I knew the water pressure was aggressive, a pounding rhythm against the tile. I imagined her stepping into the spray, the water sluicing away the grime of the city and the sweat of the day. I imagined the steam rising, fogging the mirror I kept meticulously streak-free. The thought was a physical weight in my chest. Addison, my professional rival, the woman whose form I critiqued with clinical detachment, was naked in my shower. The architectural separation of the wall between us felt impossibly thin. I turned away, breaking the trance, and walked into my bedroom. The air in here was cooler, still untouched by the humidity she was generating down the hall. I went to the dresser, my fingers trailing over the cool wood surface, before pulling open the second drawer. This was another violation of protocol. My clothes were organized by function: technical fabrics for training, structured wool for meetings, silk for the rare evening out. But in the back, folded with precision, were the soft things. The things I wore when the world was locked out. I ran my hand over the stack of cotton t-shirts. Lending her clothes felt like a distinct escalation. Offering a towel is hospitality. Offering clothing is ownership. It is draping someone in your own skin. I bypassed the newer shirts, the ones that still held their rigid shape, and pulled out a charcoal gray tee. It was vintage, the cotton worn thin and impossibly soft from years of washing. It was oversized, a garment that swallowed my own frame. I knew how it smelled, like my laundry detergent and the faint, lingering trace of my own perfume. I walked back to the bathroom door. The water was still running, a steady, thundering cascade. I knocked, the sound sharp against the wood. "Addison?" I called out, my voice pitching slightly to be heard over the noise. "Yeah?" Her voice came back muffled, stripped of its usual resonance. "I'm leaving a shirt by the door," I said. "And a towel." "Okay. Thanks." I set the items on the floor, right against the threshold, and retreated to the kitchen. I needed distance. I busied myself with the mundane, wiping down the already clean counter, rearranging the glasses, but my attention remained fixed on that closed door. Then, the water stopped. The sudden silence was louder than the noise had been. I heard the slide of the shower curtain, the soft pad of wet feet on the bath mat. I waited. The anticipation was a tight coil in my stomach, winding tighter with every passing second. The door creaked open. A plume of steam escaped first, rolling into the hallway like a physical presence. It carried a scent that stopped me in my tracks. It was the smell of my own body wash, a heavy, specific blend of sandalwood and bergamot that I had used for years. It was a scent I identified with my own skin, my own morning rituals. Smelling it now, billowing out from the bathroom where she had just used it, felt like a sensory short circuit. It was my scent, but it was attached to the heat of her body. Addison stepped out of the fog. She had scrubbed her face clean. Her skin was pink from the heat, raw and glowing in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. Her hair was wet, slicked back from her forehead, darker now that it was saturated. Water droplets clung to the ends, dripping onto the shoulders of the gray t-shirt. The shirt changed her. On the gym floor, Addison is all compression gear and sharp lines, her body armor branded and tight. She is a statue of kinetic potential. But in the oversized cotton, she looks softer. The neckline slipped off one shoulder, exposing the sharp line of her clavicle and the damp skin of her neck. The hem hid her mid-thigh, leaving her legs bare. Her feet were naked against my floor. She looked up, catching me staring. She didn't flinch this time. She didn't posture. She just stood there, holding the towel in one hand, looking impossibly real. "It fits," she said, her voice dropping a register. "It's big," I corrected, though I couldn't look away from how the fabric draped over her. "It's warm," she countered. She moved toward the living room, and I had to step aside to let her pass in the narrow hallway. The architecture of the apartment forced us into a proximity that felt dangerous. As she brushed past me, I didn't just smell the soap. I felt the heat radiating off her. It was a tangible wave of warmth, the kind of heat that comes from a body that has just been scalded clean. The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with the static of near contact. I could see the dampness of her skin, the way a single drop of water traced a path from her hairline down the side of her neck. My hand twitched at my side, a phantom impulse to reach out and stop that drop, to touch the heat source. I didn't move. I let her pass, the moment stretching out, breathless and heavy, until she stepped into the cooler air of the living room, taking the warmth with her. I bypassed the Italian leather couch entirely. It felt too rigid, too much like a waiting room for a high-stakes negotiation, where one side inevitably loses. Tonight wasn't about negotiation. It was about the unraveling of terms. I set the bottle of Cabernet down on the thick wool rug in the center of the room. It was an instinctive decision to lower the center of gravity, to bring us down to the floor where the air felt less thin and the pretenses harder to maintain. Addison followed my lead without a word. She sat cross-legged opposite me, the oversized gray t-shirt pooling around her knees, exposing the smooth, pale skin of her thighs. I poured the wine. The liquid was dark, almost black in the dim light of the apartment, swirling into the crystal with a rich, heavy sound. I handed her a glass. Our fingers didn't touch. I was careful about that. But the transfer felt heavy, as if the glass weighed 40 pounds instead of 4 ounces. We drank in silence for a moment. The wine was bold, coating the tongue, warming the chest. It was the necessary solvent for the rusting gears of our usual dynamic. The rain was still drumming against the glass, but it felt distant now, a backdrop to the quiet storm brewing on the rug. "We don't talk," she said suddenly. It wasn't a question. She was staring into her glass, watching the red legs of the wine slide down the crystal. "We talk all the time," I countered, though I knew it was a lie before the words fully left my mouth. "We talk about torque," she corrected, her voice sharp but low. "We talk about load management. We talk about the business of bodies." She looked up, her eyes dark and serious, stripping away the professional veneer. "We never talk about why we're the only 2 people left in the building at 10 o'clock every night. We never talk about what we're running from." It was a direct hit. The why was the dangerous part. The why was the hunger that drove the perfectionism, the void we filled with iron and exhaustion. "Control," I said simply. "It's about control. If I can perfect the movement, I can perfect the day." "Is it?" She took a long, deliberate sip. "I think it's about fear. Fear of being average. Fear of stopping long enough to realize you're lonely." She was dissecting me now, using the same sharp, analytical eyes she used on a client's lifting form. It was uncomfortable. It was thrilling. She saw the cracks in the porcelain. She set her glass down on the rug. The crystal made a soft, muffled thud. She leaned forward slightly, invading the space between us. The scent of my body wash on her skin was stronger now, mixed with the wine and the humidity of the room. "In the locker room," she started, her voice dropping lower, vibrating with a nervous energy I rarely saw in her. When I walked in, my pulse spiked, a sudden rhythm against my ribs. "Addison." "No," she interrupted, her hand cutting through the air. "I need to say it. I didn't just walk in. I saw the light under the door. I knew you were in there. I could have waited. I could have turned around." She paused, her gaze dropping to her hands, then snapping back up to mine with a sudden, fierce intensity. "I didn't want to wait. I wanted to see you, not the trainer, you. I wasn't looking for a towel." The admission hung in the air, stripping away the last vestige of our professional cover story. She wasn't a colleague caught in an awkward moment. She was a woman who had made a choice to look, a choice to linger. I held my glass steady, though my grip was tight enough to threaten the stem. I could have deflected. I could have offered her an out, a way to save face and retreat to the safety of the couch. But the night was too far gone for mercy. "I know," I said. The words were quiet, precise, landing with the weight of a judge's gavel. She blinked, surprised by the lack of defense. "You know? I saw you in the mirror long before I spoke," I admitted. "I saw you stop. I saw you look. And I didn't reach for the towel. I stood there." The air between us seemed to vibrate. The confession was mutual now. We were both complicit in the tension that had been building for months. "You told me to keep my eyes up," she whispered. The memory of the command was thick between us, replaying in the steam of the locker room. "I did," I replied. I leaned in, mirroring her posture, closing the distance until I could see the flecks of gold in her iris, until I could feel the heat radiating from her damp skin. "Because if you're going to look at me, Addison, I want you to own it. I don't want stolen glances. I don't want the reflection. Eyes up, I said again, soft this time, not a command, but an invitation. Look at me. She held my gaze. The challenge was accepted. The intellectual barrier, the rivalry, the job, the hierarchy, crumbled into dust. All that was left was the physical pull, the undeniable gravity that had been drawing us together since the first day she walked onto the gym floor. The distance on the rug felt irrelevant now. The space between us was charged, electric, waiting for the spark to jump the gap. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of the things we had been terrified to say, and the terrifying realization that we had both been saying them silently for months. I should get the linens, I said. The sentence was a lie, a structural beam thrown up desperately to support a collapsing roof. The couch pulls out. It's not a sleeper sofa, technically, but the cushions are deep enough. I gestured vaguely toward the Italian leather sofa behind us. In the daylight, it was a masterpiece of modern design. Sleek, low profile, cool to the touch. Now, in the dim amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the rain-streaked window, it looked like a barricade. It was the designated boundary line. It was the safe zone where Addison was supposed to sleep, separated from me by a wall of drywall and professional propriety. Addison looked at the couch. She didn't turn her head. She just shifted her eyes, assessing the furniture with the same detached scrutiny she applied to a piece of faulty gym equipment. Then her gaze slid back to me. She didn't move. She didn't make the polite, guest-like motion to stand up. She didn't offer to help find the pillows. She stayed rooted to the rug, her legs crossed, her wine glass resting dangerously close to her bare knee. Right, she said. The couch. The words hung there, heavy and useless. Neither of us made a move to execute the plan. The air between us was thick, viscous with the truth we had just laid bare. To stand up now, to walk to the linen closet and retrieve a crisp white sheet, to go through the domestic pantomime of making a bed, felt impossible. It would be a retreat. It would be an admission that the fear was stronger than the gravity pulling us together. I watched her hand. It was resting on the rug, inches from mine. Her fingers were long, calloused from the knurling of barbells, hands that knew how to grip, how to pull, how to hold tension. I watched her index finger trace a slow, idle circle on the wool of the rug. The movement was hypnotic. It was a small, unconscious betrayal of the stillness she was trying to project. Then the circle stopped. She reached out. It wasn't a grab. It wasn't aggressive. It was a test. Her fingers brushed against the back of my hand, a feather-like contact that sent a shockwave straight up my arm, seizing in my chest. I stopped breathing. The contact was tentative, a question asked in the language of skin. She waited, her fingertips resting against my knuckles, giving me the chance to pull away, giving me the chance to reestablish the perimeter. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. My biomechanics, usually so obedient, failed me. The signal from my brain to my muscles, withdraw, retreat, secure, was intercepted by a louder, primal command to stay. She slid her hand further, her palm covering mine. Her skin was warm, dry, and rough in the way that only a lifter's hands are rough. It was a texture I knew intimately from my own body, but feeling it from her was a revelation. It grounded me. It terrified me. I looked down at our joined hands. My own hand, usually steady enough to thread a needle or spot a 300-pound squat without a tremor, was shaking. It was a microscopic vibration, invisible to anyone else, but I felt it. I felt the loss of precision. The control I worshipped, the ironclad discipline that defined my career and my life, was dissolving under the heat of her palm. "You're shaking," she whispered. It wasn't an accusation. It was a wonder. "I'm not," I lied automatically. "You are." She tightened her grip, her thumb pressing into the soft space between my thumb and forefinger. "I am too." I looked up at her face. The mask was completely gone. Her eyes were wide, dark pupils swallowing the iris, searching mine for a sign. She looked terrified, but resolved. She looked like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the wind to decide which way she would fall. "Can I stay here?" she asked. The question echoed the one she had asked in the locker room, But the context had shifted tectonically. In the locker room, here meant my apartment, a roof over her head. Now, here meant something else entirely. It meant right here, on this rug, in this space less than 2 feet from me. It meant inside the perimeter. It meant abandoning the couch and the safety it represented. "The couch is uncomfortable," I murmured, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "It's leather. It gets cold." "I don't care about the couch," she said, her voice hitching slightly. "I want to stay here." She leaned forward, a fraction of an inch. It was a subtle shift in her center of gravity, but in the charged atmosphere of the room, it felt like a lunge. She was invading my personal space, deliberately and invitingly. I had a choice. I could pull my hand back. I could stand up, walk to the closet, get the sheets, and end the night in separate rooms, preserving the rivalry, preserving the job. I could wake up tomorrow and pretend this was just a favor for a colleague in distress. Or I could burn it all down. I released a breath I felt like I had been holding for 6 months. I turned my hand over, interlocking my fingers with hers. The fit was perfect, tight, strong, inevitable. I used the grip to pull myself forward, bridging the final gap between us. The movement was fluid, abandoning the rigid mechanics of the gym for something softer, something desperate. I saw her eyes flutter shut as I moved into her space. I felt the heat of her breath against my lips, smelling of wine and anticipation. The couch was forgotten. The apartment was forgotten. There was only the terrifying proximity of her, the collapse of the boundary, and the moment before the impact. I didn't hesitate. I leaned in and pressed my lips to hers. The kiss was not a collision. It was a slow, heavy release, the kind of structural failure that happens when a load has been bearing down on a support beam for too long, and the steel finally, inevitably, bends. It started tentative, a question asked against my mouth, but the answer was immediate. I felt the tension leave her body in a rush, a physical exhalation that mirrored my own. The months of professional distance, of tracking each other's movements across the gym floor, of correcting form and counting reps while ignoring the heat rising under our collars, it all evaporated. She tasted of the Cabernet, dark, rich, and tannic, and of something sharper, something uniquely her. It was the taste of the adrenaline she lived on. Her hands, usually so disciplined in their grip on a barbell, were suddenly everywhere. One tangled in the hair at the nape of my neck, the calluses on her palms scraping gently against my scalp, sending shivers cascading down my spine. The other hand gripped my waist, her thumb pressing into the oblique muscle with a familiarity that made my breath hitch. She knew exactly where to hold me. She knew the anatomy of my body better than anyone because she had spent half a year studying it in motion. I pulled her closer, my hands bunching in the fabric of the oversized gray t-shirt I had lent her. The cotton was soft, worn thin by years of washing, a stark contrast to the hard, unyielding muscle beneath it. I felt the strength in her shoulders, the solid ridge of her deltoids under my palms. It was a heady, intoxicating mix, the softness of the domestic setting and the hardness of the athlete I knew her to be. We were two apex predators who had finally stopped circling and started colliding. We didn't make a conscious decision to move. It was a magnetic pull, a shift in gravity. The living room floor, with its expansive rug and floor-to-ceiling windows, felt too open, too exposed to the city lights bleeding through the rain. We needed walls. We needed the dark. I stood up, pulling her with me, our mouths separating only long enough to catch a ragged breath. The look she gave me then, pupils blown wide, lips swollen, the mask of the professional rival completely shattered, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We moved down the hallway to my bedroom, a space I guarded even more fiercely than my gym schedule. It was a room of shadows and silence, the air cool and still. But as we crossed the threshold, we brought the storm with us. The bed was low, the sheets cool against my skin as we tumbled onto them, a tangle of limbs and urgency. The heat between us was moderate but pervasive, a slow burn that seeped into the marrow. It wasn't the frantic, desperate fumbling of strangers. It was the deliberate, heavy friction of two people who understood the mechanics of resistance and release. When her skin brushed against mine, it felt like a completion. I ran my hands down the length of her back, tracing the spine I had watched flex under heavy loads, feeling the way her muscles shifted and yielded under my touch. There is a terrifying vulnerability in letting someone who knows your strength see you weak. I pride myself on precision, on never faltering under weight. But here, in the dark, with Addison's weight pressing me into the mattress, I didn't want to be strong. I wanted to unravel. I wanted to let go of the control I held on to so tightly. And she let me. She met my intensity with her own, but she also offered a softness I hadn't expected. Her touch was demanding but reverent, exploring my body not as a machine to be optimized, but as a landscape to be known. Addison. I breathed her name, the sound lost against her skin. It was an admission of defeat in the best possible way. This wasn't just a hookup. I realized it with a jolt of panic that was quickly swallowed by the pleasure of her hands on me. The chemistry was too real, too sustainable. It wasn't just the physical release of pent-up rivalry. It was an alignment. We fit together with a terrifying precision. The way she moved, the way she breathed, the way she anticipated my reactions. It was a language we were both fluent in, finally speaking it out loud. The darkness of the room settled around us, heavy and protective. The rain continued to drum against the window, but it was distant now, a rhythm for a world that no longer concerned us. We were tangled together, limbs heavy, breath slowing but still synchronized. The line had been broken. The professional boundary was gone, replaced by something far more permanent and far more dangerous. I closed my eyes, feeling the steady beat of her heart against my chest, and knew there was no going back to the way things were. The precision had crumbled, and in the wreckage, we had found something real. The morning sun didn't filter into the room. It assaulted it. The light was harsh, white, and unforgiving, slicing through the gap in the blackout curtains I had neglected to close fully. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air and exposed the chaotic, tangled wreckage of the sheets. It wasn't a romantic glow. It was a forensic light, revealing every detail of the night's indiscretion. I woke with a start, my internal clock screaming that the routine had been shattered. My hand shot out across the mattress, seeking the solid heat I had fallen asleep against, the anchor that had kept me grounded in the dark. My fingers met cool cotton. The space beside me was empty. The pillow still held the indentation of her head, a hollow proof of presence, but the warmth was fading. Panic, sharp and cold, flooded my chest. It was the immediate, sinking nausea of a mistake realized too late. She had left. She had woken up in the sobering, clinical light of day, looked at the reality of sleeping with her professional rival, and fled back to the safety of the distance we maintained. The narrative wrote itself in my head. The regret, the awkward text message, the avoidance in the break room. I had opened the fortress, and she had taken the first opportunity to escape. I swung my legs out of bed, ignoring the deep, unfamiliar soreness in my muscles that had nothing to do with deadlifts. I grabbed my silk robe, wrapping it tight like armor, and walked into the hallway. The silence of the apartment felt heavy again, accusing. I prepared myself for the empty living room, for the humiliation of having misread the permanence of the night. Then I smelled it. Coffee. Not the emergency pods I kept for guests I didn't want to stay, but the good beans, ground fresh. I turned the corner into the kitchen. Addison was there. She was leaning against the quartz island, holding a ceramic mug with both hands. She was still wearing the vintage gray t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy, loose knot that defied the severe ponytail she wore on the gym floor. She looked ridiculously domestic. She looked like she belonged there. The sight of her standing in my kitchen, illuminated by the morning sun, felt more dangerous than the sex had. Intimacy in the dark is biology. Making coffee in someone's kitchen is a declaration of presence. She looked up as I entered. She didn't look guilty. She didn't look like she was planning an escape route. She looked steady. "I found the grinder," she said, her voice a little rough from sleep. "Hope that's okay." "You stayed," I said. It wasn't the eloquent morning greeting I had planned, but it was the only truth that mattered. "I told you," she replied, taking a slow sip from the mug, her eyes never leaving mine. "I couldn't go home, and I didn't want to go anywhere else." I walked over to the island. The distance between us was gone. The tension of the will we, won't we was replaced by the heavy gravity of we did. I poured myself a cup, the ceramic clinking softly against the counter. "We have to be at the studio in an hour," I said, leaning against the counter next to her. "We have the morning block, the 7 a.m. crowd." "I know." She turned to face me fully. The sunlight caught the line of her jaw, the place I had kissed hours ago. "It's going to be weird. The mirrors, the clients, everyone watching us and not knowing." "We can't pretend it didn't happen," I said, my voice firm. "I don't do regression. I don't backtrack." "Good," she said, her gaze unflinching. "Because I'm not going back to the Cold War. I'm done fighting you for territory. It's exhausting. The rivalry, that sharp, exhausting architecture we had built to keep ourselves motivated and isolated, was effectively demolished. We couldn't go back to being apex predators circling each other. We knew too much now. I knew the sound of her breath when she let go. She knew the way my hands shook when I lost control. The mystery was gone, replaced by an alliance. "Alliance?" she suggested, a small, wry smile touching her lips. "Alliance," I agreed. She finished her coffee and set the mug down next to mine. The 2 circles of ceramic touching on the counter felt like a seal. "I need a shower," she said, "and I need to borrow something that isn't this shirt, unless you want me training clients in your vintage loungewear." "I have some spare gear," I said. "It might be a little tight in the shoulders. I'll make it work." We moved apart to get ready, but the energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't the frantic heat of the night, but a steady, functional warmth. We were leaving the sanctuary, heading back to the war zone of the gym, but for the first time, I wasn't going into battle alone. Walking back into the studio felt like stepping onto a movie set after the cameras had stopped rolling. The air was exactly the same as it had been the night before, heavy with the scent of rubber mats, recycled air, and the sharp chemical tang of high-grade disinfectant. But the context had shifted so violently that it felt like a different world. Before, this place was a battlefield where we fought a silent war for dominance. Now, it was just a room. The terror of the rivalry had evaporated, leaving behind a strange, calm clarity. We slipped back into our professional skins in the staff room. It was a practice transformation. The hair went up tight, the branded gear went on, correcting posture and smoothing lines. We put on the masks of the senior trainers, the untouchable experts who demanded perfection. But as I watched Addison lace up her lifting shoes, I saw the hesitation in her fingers, the slight tremor that mirrored my own. We were putting the armor back on, but we both knew what lay beneath it now. We knew the softness under the steel. The morning block was a blur of motion and noise. The 7 a.m. crowd is aggressive. Finance types and lawyers who treat their bodies like assets to be managed. The music was loud, a driving bass line designed to keep the heart rates high. I moved through the floor, correcting a deadlift here, adjusting a rack height there, my voice projecting the same authority it always had. Chest up, drive through the heels, control the eccentric. The commands were muscle memory, but my focus was split. Every time I turned my head, my radar pinged her location. She was on the turf strip, running an agility drill with a client. I watched her demonstrate a lateral bound, her body moving with that explosive, terrifying grace I had always envied. But this time, I didn't feel the spike of jealousy. I felt a possessive warmth curl in my gut. I knew the weight of that body. I knew how she sounded when the breath left her lungs in the dark. She must have felt me looking. In the middle of the chaos, across 30 feet of crowded gym floor, she stopped. She turned her head, ignoring the client waiting for instruction, and locked eyes with me. The noise of the gym seemed to drop away. The clatter of weights and the thumping bass faded into white noise. It was just us, connected by an invisible, high-tension wire. She raised an eyebrow, a microscopic challenge, a question. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I simply mouthed the words, "Eyes up." A slow, knowing smirk touched the corner of her mouth. Not the sharp, competitive grin of a rival, but the intimate, shared secret of a lover. She held my gaze for a second longer than was professional, a deliberate breach of protocol, before turning back to her client. I turned back to my own session, my heart hammering a rhythm that had nothing to do with cardio. I realized then that my sanctuary wasn't the apartment with the white walls, and it wasn't the sterile precision of this gym. Those were just containers. The sanctuary was the connection. It was the terrifying, messy, beautiful thing we had built in the span of 12 hours. The precision I had worshipped for so long hadn't crumbled. It had just found a new focus. I wasn't training for isolation anymore. I was training to be strong enough to hold this. The Cold War was over. The borders were open. And as I watched Addison laugh at something her client said, a genuine, unguarded sound, I knew that the permanency of the night wasn't a question. It was a fact. We had broken the line, and neither of us had any intention of fixing it. I watched Addison work, knowing the texture of her skin under the uniform, knowing the heat she carried. Professional boundaries are useful structures, but breaking them was necessary to find the truth underneath. If you've ever found clarity in the blur of a moment like this, subscribe for more stories. The locker room door closes again, but this time, I am not alone.